Now that One Piece is getting its live-action adaptation, we've already reported before that Yu Yu Hakusho is getting its own Netflix show in the future, and then when we look at other shows like Death Note and more, there has definitely been a trend towards live-action. And you could even look at video games as an example of shows that are trying to expand with this when we look at The Last of Us, where it was a video game, and it was adapted into an actual TV show. But the thing is that this leaves a big question about the Dragon Ball franchise, and more specifically, is Dragon Ball next? Well, I'm gonna flat out say right here in the beginning of the video that I'm going to make a claim, and I'm willing to live and die on my claim, that within the next 5 years, I predict that Dragon Ball is probably going to get some type of live adaptation. Now, Dragon Ball has already been going in the direction of 3D graphics, which, I mean, let's be honest, the Dragon Ball fan base is very mixed on this, and I'd like to hear more of your thoughts in the comment section below, more specifically about this, because I've noticed the Dragon Ball community is extremely mixed when it comes to the 3D animation, where I've seen some fans that absolutely love it, and I've also seen a good amount of fans that absolutely hate it, and if I had to give a slight edge, I'd say fans slightly dislike it more than they like it. But that's besides the point. The point that we're trying to get at is that Dragon Ball has been experimenting with a lot of things over the last few years, and this leaves a question of, will Dragon Ball eventually be adapted into a live-action form? Now, obviously, like One Piece, the big question comes in, well, what part of Dragon Ball are you going to adapt? Obviously, they're not going to adapt GT, so we could already scratch that out of the way. Now, this basically leaves Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, and Dragon Ball Super, and considering the fact that Dragon Ball Super didn't perform as well as Ball and Z, we can pretty much scratch that off. And let's just be completely honest, guys. You guys would not want to watch a live-action adaptation of Dragon Ball Super, so we can clearly just write that out. Now that basically leaves Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, and from a marketing point of view, it makes logical sense for Dragon Ball Z to get the adaptation. But if I'm being realistic, what I think would make an actual better show, I actually think Dragon Ball would be better. Now, obviously, if you guys want to go out there and look, there have already been other live-action Dragon Ball movies besides Dragon Ball Evolution that are really old, and to be completely honest with you, they're completely garbage. But, in this particular case, if you were to reset the Dragon Ball universe, I think that it would actually be best to start off with a Kid Goku, and the show would focus on Kid Goku growing up and becoming an adult at the end of the 23rd tournament. I think it would make a very, very good mini-series, and I think it would really show the hero's journey more than any other Dragon Ball storyline, because if you were to focus on Dragon Ball Z, Goku's already developed and he just gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and the hero's journey isn't as strong when you don't see the transition looking at Goku going from a child all the way to an adult, and obviously seeing that over time Goku has to face against significantly stronger villains over and over again, from King Piccolo to obviously Piccolo Jr., and I think that from a storytelling point, obviously seeing like a Yamcha and a Krillin and a Bulma and all of that, I think Dragon Ball would be a lot better, especially because in Dragon Ball, the fighting style is a lot more down to earth, there's a lot more kung fu, and obviously, you know, there's a lot more real martial arts and elements to it that I feel like if you were trying to adapt Dragon Ball Z, considering the fact that, you know, One Piece has a massive budget, I feel like you would need a massive budget for Dragon Ball Z, and I also kind of feel like, let's just be honest, it would just not look as good. I feel like the way that characters fight in Dragon Ball Z is so out there in terms of the flying, shooting ki blasts, doing all of those things. I feel like any type of live-action adaptation of Dragon Ball Z would feel like a disservice to fans, and as a result of that, I would feel, honestly, in my heart, that a live-action Dragon Ball Z adaptation would simply just not work, and it would look terrible. But if you were to scale it down for Dragon Ball, I definitely think that it would be a lot better. Now, we now have to move on to another element here when it comes to marketing, and also how fans would receive this. Now, to be honest with you, I feel like whenever we're on the subject of live action, right, like just like what I talked about with my Yu Yu Hakusho video, with the Yu Yu Hakusho Netflix show coming up, is that there's always this risk that fans feel right? Whenever they see something that's live action, it's like, oh boy, here you are to like ruin, my experience watching these shows and seeing it be transformed into a worse version. I feel like every single fan in the back of their head kind of has that feeling whenever they see something like this. And one good example, which was originally a comic which was adapted, would be The Walking Dead, which was a comic that turned into a TV show, and because zombies are more down to earth, it worked out in that sense. And then if you look at something else like Invincible, which was a comic, once again, which was adapted into an actual animation, I feel like that's totally different, and most fans have definitely appreciated the Invincible recreation. But I feel like with something with Dragon Ball, because of all of the poor failing live-action shows combined with all of the poor failing live-action Dragon Ball shows, I just feel like the Dragon Ball fan base is simply just not ready for this, and I honestly feel like the Dragon Ball fan base is simply just prepared to accept a Dragon Ball Super return, or, in contrast, the Dragon Ball community would be satisfied at least getting animated movies coming up. Now, if these movies continue to be 3D, I'm pretty sure the fan base is not going to be very happy about this, because I feel like there's a huge sect of the fan base that's very, very, very classical in their approach to Dragon Ball and wants that classic 2D animation. And even though, if you look at the Battle of Gods movie and Resurrection of F movies, there were parts of those films that were 3D, and for the most part, the Dragon Ball community completely tore it apart. So when Super Hero came out, I was like, oh boy, this is not going to be good. And for the most part, and based off of previous polls, most people generally liked Super Hero. There were definitely some people who didn't, but for the most part, it performed fairly well. Now, this could also be a part of Dragon Ball Starvation, and this is the last major point that we're going to make in the video. I feel like life repeats itself over and over again, and right now in the Dragon Ball community, it kind of feels like the beginning of the Dragon Ball YouTube community when I started years ago, where there wasn't an alive Dragon Ball, and because of that, there was this huge hunger for Dragon Ball, and as a result of it, it's kind of like history's repeating itself, where the hunger came, and then Super came, and then we were oversaturated with Super, and then when Super ended, or took its hiatus, you could say, then that basically just caused the Dragon Ball community to go into this state of chilling out with Dragon Ball for a while, and now we're once again getting hungry again for Dragon Ball, and because of this hunger, there is a fear that the Dragon Ball community might be so hungry for new Dragon Ball, that if this new live-action show were to ever come out in the future, they might not necessarily be able to criticize it the proper way into whether or not it's actually a good show, and they just like it because they're simply just getting new Dragon Ball. And I feel like, as a result of that, that's a lot of what happened in Dragon Ball Super. Fans were so hungry for new Dragon Ball that they weren't being objective about how good Dragon Ball Super actually was, and that's ultimately the biggest fear. But let me know whether or not you believe a live-action Dragon Ball is ever going to happen in the future. And let me just point out that I have no inside information saying this. This is just an assessment based off of the trend of anime in general.